Well, in the course of the establishment of the State of Israel, back in 47, 48, there was fighting between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians did not accept the idea of the creation of the State of Israel. And so there's fighting between the Israelis and the Palestinians, with each side wanting to force its will on the other side. At the end of the day, Israel was able to create itself, to establish itself. But in doing so, it in fact came to control something like 78% of the territory that the Palestinians considered to be theirs. And in that process also, secondly, a number of Palestinians were displaced. And the number is about 700,000 people who had to leave their homes. They were either expelled, or they were forced out, or they were terrified, and so they had to leave. And so there's this displacement, which in fact is the origin of the refugee problem, the Palestinian refugee problem. Well, ideally speaking, the world shouldn't care. And ideally speaking, perhaps if the Israelis and the Palestinians want to go on killing themselves, they should be left, or we should be left, that is to say, to do this. But this can't happen, because the fighting that goes on in the Middle East immediately has impact on other parts of the Middle East. And in those other parts, there are strategic interests for the rest of the world. Now, the least such interest is, of course, the oil interests in the Middle East, the stability, the economic interests of the various countries in the Middle East. And very quickly, any kind of fire that can be ignited in that particular region can very quickly spread throughout the region. And in a way, if you look at, for example, the way the war now is evolving in Iraq, and the tensions are also mounting in Iran, you will find, if you look closely, that in fact they're related at some level or another to the whole conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the conflict between the Jewish nation on the one hand and the Arab world on the other. So if one is able to address that particular problem, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if one is able to basically transform the paradigm that exists today in that area, so that instead of having war between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or between the Jews and the Muslims, if instead of this what you do is to create a paradigm of cooperation, of peace, of stability, then this can actually reflect itself in stability and peace in the rest of the region, and therefore also in the rest of the world. The Israelis wish to have a Jewish state for themselves, and the Arabs primarily want a state for themselves, for the Arabs. Now, the guiding line for establishing two states for the borders is the resolution that was passed by the United Nations back in '67, called United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which basically says, let's go back to the 1949 armistice line, or the '67 line, and let's use that as the basic line dividing between a Jewish state on the to the west of this line, Israel, and a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, which is the remaining territory of Palestine. But the problem of this, of course, is that, first of all, it is, that territory is 22% of the entire land that the Palestinians regard as their own. It doesn't address the refugee problem, the millions of Palestinians who are outside now, the descendants of the refugees that have been forced to leave or had to leave. And it doesn't settle that other major issue, which is of major emotional value, which is Jerusalem. How do you deal with Jerusalem? And so, although the plans are out there, in general, that maybe this is the only practical solution, if it's not the perfect solution, nonetheless, there's still these issues that are left on the table that have to be dealt with, once again, namely, for instance, how do we deal with Jerusalem, and how do we deal with the refugees? In addition, of course, to problems like the settlements, the Israeli settlers that have settled in the West Bank, Gaza, now together with the people that have come to live in the Jerusalem area, maybe number about just under 500,000 people. So what do you do with them? These are the main questions that need to be addressed. Now, what I'm suggesting is that there be a trade-off between the one issue, the refugees, and the other, Jerusalem, in the following way, that although on the one hand the refugees are an important issue from the Palestinian point of view, I suggest that they may be able to cede on that particular issue by being offered something somewhere else, namely in Jerusalem. Because if the Palestinians were to be able to claim back East Jerusalem with the supervision over the holy areas and religious areas for the Muslims and the Christians, from their point of view, that would be sufficient compromise or sufficient compensation. Likewise, from the Israeli point of view, that although, of course, the issue of Jerusalem is very important, but on the other hand, if they were to be able to guarantee for themselves the Jewish nature or character of the State of Israel, then maybe they would be prepared to cede or give way on their position on Jerusalem in return for preserving the Jewish character of the Israeli state, which they can do if the Palestinians will accept not pushing for returning the refugees into or inside Israel. So the trade-off is basically between, on the one hand, the Palestinians accepting to take over East Jerusalem in general, in return for them accepting not to insist on returning the refugees into Israel proper. There would be two states. The Palestinian refugees would return to the Palestinian state only. Of course, there can be compensation, but they will return to the Palestinian state only. Now, as far as Jerusalem is concerned, it can be shared, it can be an open city. The Clinton parameters can apply, namely that Arab neighborhoods can come under Arab sovereignty and together constitute the East Jerusalem that will be the capital of the Palestinian state, whereas, Israel will continue to have West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, in addition to the Jewish neighborhoods that have been built since 1967, including the area in the Jewish quarter in the Old City. Now, this seems to me to be a good compromise. As for the 1 square kilometer area, which is the area where the Wailing Wall Plaza and the Noble Sanctuary Plaza is my suggestion, since there is dispute over this, to have the area be declared as falling under the sovereignty of God, while giving the Israeli side the ability to continue operating the Wailing Wall Plaza on behalf of the Jewish people, as it has been doing, and giving the Palestinian side the ability to operate the Haram Plaza on behalf of the Muslims, as it has been doing. So there you don't have to have sovereignty by either side of that area, but to all intents and purposes, you can continue having the rights of religious rights of the Jews and Muslims as they have been happening in the past. I think there's a kind of predisposition on the part of both publics, the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, at some level, to in fact go for or support such an agreement if it were to be signed by the two leaderships. In other words, they can come back, present this draft declaration, if you like, to their respective constituencies and suggest or propose that they can run for elections on the basis of this declaration as a political platform. And in doing this, public debate can be generated on both sides. And my feeling is that if a democratic debate is generated, in the final analysis, both sides we will find support on both sides for this for such an agreement.